Photograph from 1877 records the outlaw Billy the Kid in a gambling setting, in a saloon. On the left, he wears a white shirt, dark vest, and top hat. He is at the table with 3 companions. The 4 keep their hands under the tabletop, a gesture of caution. On the table, an almost empty liquor bottle indicates a long stay. In 1885, after the death of Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt took refuge in the Badlands of North Dakota, adopted cowboy clothing, and rode on patrols. He criticized William McKinley for lacking firmness, but in March 1901 became his vice president. With McKinley's assassination in September 1901, he became President of the United States. Photograph from around 1890 shows 2 sex workers posing in a brothel in Alaska. During the westward expansion, flows of male migrants occupied frontiers in search of income. The demographic imbalance favored brothels run by madams, who organized rates, lodging, and internal rules. In 1892, in Michigan, a pile of American bison skulls was raised, a record of mass slaughter. The bison once roamed the plains, about 60 million, sustaining indigenous peoples with food, clothing, and shelter. For many native nations, it remained sacred. The westward expansion of the 19th century nearly wiped out the herds of the Great Plains. In 1901, during the visit of Lakota leader American Horse to Billings, Montana, 2 young Cheyenne women gather under a pine tree. They wear cotton skirts and shawls from their people. On the left, one steadies her companion. The other stares at the observer, opening a dialogue between traditions and the West. A moment that unites the official visit and the life of those who were there. Photograph from 1885 portrays a company of Texas Rangers in a studio. Standardized uniforms and weapons suggest preparation for field service. The Corps, with jurisdiction throughout Texas, carried out border patrols, repression of banditry, and territorial conflicts, marking central episodes of the Old West. Around 1890, in an Alaskan brothel, 2 sex workers posed for a photo. In the context of the Old West, the rush for work drew crowds of men to the frontier. The demographic imbalance fueled brothels run by madams, who organized services, local incomes, and influenced urban economies. At the end of the 19th century, families scattered across the American West lived far from towns and safe routes. When someone arrived with a camera, they carried furniture to the yard and displayed tools, harvests, and animals. It became a stage that said, "We have broken isolation. We have a future here." It was a deliberate gesture to mark progress and put themselves on the map. In 1878, a photograph records passers-by on a street in Dodge City. Like Deadwood, the town became a symbol of the frontier Old West in Kansas. There were numerous saloons and brothels. The reputation attracted gunmen and robbers. Traditions cite Billy the Kid and Jesse James among the visitors of the time. Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, known as Pat Garrett, was sheriff of Lincoln County and gained notoriety for killing Billy the Kid in 1881 in Fort Sumner. Years later, on February 29, 1908, he was shot dead near Las Cruces, New Mexico. Many historians place him among the main lawmen of the Old West. Ashishishe, a Crow Scout known to whites as Curly, served under Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. On June 25, 1876, he watched from a hilltop the Battle of Little Bighorn in the Montana Territory. With the collapse of the 7th Cavalry, he rode to report. Custer had fallen. His account shaped the memory of the West. It was the height of the Plains Wars. Photograph of Sheriff Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, Pat Garrett. He served in Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, and gained notoriety for killing William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid, in 1881. Garrett was shot dead near Las Cruces on February 29, 1908. Many regard him as one of the central sheriffs of the Old West. In 1886, a family of immigrants reached the Nebraska plains after a long journey on trails and railroads. They carried trunks, a few utensils, and realistic hopes for land and work. The father watched the horizon. The mother organized the children and supplies. They settled near a trading post, the first step in local colonization. On June 2, 1899, near Wilcox, Wyoming, a Union Pacific train was stopped by masked men. They ordered the engine and express car to move ahead, separating them from the rest. With dynamite, they blew open the safe, took about $30,000 and fled on horseback, changing mounts along the way. The deed was attributed to Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch. Photograph dated around 1880 shows a group of men in front of a saloon in Miles City, Montana, United States. On the frontier, the exhausting journey limited leisure. After work, only drinking and conversation remained. The scene highlights male sociability typical of expanding settlements of the period. Around 1907, Apache leader Geronimo, a central figure of Bedonkohe resistance, is seen. Since the massacre in 1851 of his wife and 3 children by Mexican troops, he led successive attacks against Mexico and the United States, resisting the occupation of ancestral lands in present-day Arizona and New Mexico over the following decades. On April 8, 1905, after a shootout in Canyon Diablo, Arizona, the lawmen removed the body of outlaw John Shaw from his coffin, propped the dead man against a fence in front of the saloon, and placed a bottle in his hand for one last swig of whiskey. The scene became the town's trophy, a mix of dark humor and warning. Here outlaws don't meet a pretty end. Photograph from 1900. Businessmen pose with the famous 20-mule team, double wagons pulled by 20 mules, used to carry borax from Harmony Borax Works in Death Valley to the railroad in Mojave. The scene illustrates the austere logistics of mining in the West, under the extreme and arid climate of California. In 1886, James Brown Miller, known as Deacon Jim, was already working as a hired gun in the West. He charged between $150 and $2,000 per job. He preferred nighttime ambushes, hidden by a black coat, usually with a double-barreled shotgun, carefully picking escape routes. He is credited with about a dozen deaths in shootouts, which cemented his reputation. Around 1908, a northern Cheyenne leader leads the Sundance in southeastern Montana, in a circle with his people. His body is painted red and black, on his head braided branches. The rite combines fasting, singing, and endurance to the sound of the drum. It marks passage through symbolic death and the rebirth of the group, renewing alliances and memory. Photograph taken in May 1862. A settler family poses in front of a wooden rural dwelling, in an area that then belonged to Nebraska Territory, before the creation of Custer County, 1877, and statehood, 1867. The image records typical clothing and utensils of the agricultural frontier. At the start of the 20th century, the main street of Manhattan, Nevada, bustled with miners, merchants, and wagons. Founded in 1867 after a silver discovery, the town was reborn in 1905 when gold drew a new wave of settlers. More than 4,000 people flocked to the district, building services, businesses, and housing in just a few years. In 1908 in Texas, Cowboy Harry Campbell of the Matador Ranch cuts the hair of Canadian George Patello, reporter and writer. The scene takes place in a semi-dugout line camp, the ranch's first headquarters, and reveals how the frontier mixed hard work with outsiders wanting to understand that world. A direct portrait of life on the frontier. Photograph of Sitting Bull, Hunkpapa Lakota chief, central figure of resistance on the Great Plains in the 19th century. Alongside Sioux and Cheyenne, he mobilized thousands against the 7th U.S. Cavalry Regiment in 1876, a victory at Little Bighorn. He later sought refuge in Canada, returning in 1881. In 1863, young Union cavalry officer George Armstrong Custer, newly promoted to General of Volunteers, appears during the Civil War in campaign. Years later, in the Little Bighorn Valley, 1876, he would be defeated along with his 7th Cavalry by Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, a landmark of frontier conflicts in the U.S. West. Anna Emmeline McDoulet, known as Cattle Annie, rode armed at 13 in what was then the Oklahoma Territory, USA. Alongside her friend Jenny Stevens, Little Britches, they knew how to handle revolvers and carbines. They stole and resold horses, traded whiskey with the Osage and Pawnee, and carried ammunition to outlaw gangs until they were arrested by federal deputies in 1895. Photograph dated around 1907 shows a group of cowboys gathered at the counter, drinking and exchanging banter, served by a bartender. The scene takes place in a bar in Tascosa, Oldham County, in the Texas Panhandle, and highlights social and leisure practices typical of the American West in the early 20th century. In 1890, in Nebraska, a farm family paused their work to record their presence in front of the windmill that provided water for their cattle and crops. The father kept his hat on, the mother held the youngest child, and the older ones lined up around them, showing the cohesion of life on the Great Plains. The scene reflects the agricultural expansion of the period. A Texas cowboy poses next to a Plains Indian, perhaps Kiowa or Comanche. Boots with spurs, belt with a large knife, and a revolver in a tooled leather holster. Around 1870, in frontier times, the pose displays pride and survival tools, while the tension between their worlds is hinted at in the framing. Photographic record from around 1870 documents the arrival of migrants to the American West. In the scene, dozens of wagons advance in a column, driven by families and drivers. The group reaches a newly formed urban nucleus, still unnamed, a sign of territorial expansion and settlement routes. Around 1880, a group of men gathered in front of a saloon in Miles City, Montana. With ranch work done for the day, they spent the evening drinking and talking. In these growing towns, the saloon was a meeting point for cowboys, merchants, and travelers, a place to exchange news and find relief after long cattle trail journeys. In 1847, after a Crow warrior killed his flathead wife, John liver-eating Johnston began a vendetta that lasted for years. He hunted Crow groups across the Rocky Mountains, plains, and rivers. Frontier accounts say he killed hundreds and took their livers as a warning. Myth and blood intertwine. Taken in 1908, the photograph documents hunters in front of a rustic cabin in Arizona, accompanied by their hunting dogs. The clothing, bolt-action rifles, and trophies displayed suggest seasonal hunting, typical of the American West in the early decades of the 20th century, indicating camp sociability. Belle Starr, a notorious outlaw of the late 19th century. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley, she gained fame as the Bandit Queen for moving among cattle rustlers and train robbers, including Jesse James. Her biography combines sparse records and romanticized stories, sparking disputes over her crimes and her real leadership. Jordan, Montana, in the east of the state, around 1904. In Bob Levitt's saloon, cowboys lean against the door for a quick breath between cattle and dust. They speak softly, adjust their spurs, while a saddled horse waits tied to the post. It is the trail's meeting point where deals are made, news is heard, and the next departure is decided. Photograph dated around 1905 shows urban supply workers driving an animal-drawn cart. Two men pull a large barrel, while another guides the vehicle on a dirt street. The scene highlights everyday methods of transporting water before the spread of piped networks. Olive Oatman, captured in 1851 in the Gila Valley, then part of New Mexico, saw her parents killed by the Yavapai. She and her 7-year-old sister Mary Ann were enslaved, and the following year traded to the Mojave for blankets and a horse. There they received chin tattoos. Hunger killed Mary Ann. Olive was rescued in 1856 near Fort Yuma. In October 1862, weeks after Antietam, Abraham Lincoln traveled to Sharpsburg, Maryland to review Union troops. At his side were Allen Pinkerton, head of intelligence, and General John A. McClernand. They toured the camp near the old battlefield, checking morale and supplies and assessing the next steps of the war. Studio portrait from 1875 shows the outlaw Jesse James, a former Confederate guerrilla and central figure of the James Younger Gang. He acted as a bank and train robber and was linked to homicides in Missouri. With a high bounty, he was killed in 1882 in his home in St. Joseph by Robert Ford of the gang. Around 1900, Nat Love, an ex-slave who became a cowboy after the Civil War, posed in work clothes with a confident stance. Known as Deadwood Dick, he rode cattle trails and took part in rodeos. His story sums up the black presence in the West and the search for recognition and equality after emancipation between Arizona and the Dakotas. At Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry Regiment surrounded a Lakota camp to confiscate weapons, fearing the ghost dance would turn into an uprising. A shot of uncertain origin began crossfire with Hotchkiss cannons. In less than an hour, 150 to 300 natives, mostly women and children, were killed. Photo from 1893 shows workers in a locality of the Oklahoma Territory receiving piped water for the first time. In a recent settlement, distribution required construction and coordination. The water tower under construction, core of the system, would ensure pressure and regularity for the community's initial supply. In 1890, at the end of summer, a Cheyenne family set up camp on the Montana plains. By a creek lined up teepees sheltered generations, grandparents preparing dried meat, parents fixing saddles, and children gathering firewood. Between visits from federal agents and hunters, they kept rituals and exchanges, adjusting to the pressure of the new regime. In 1948, in the hills of Montana, the last survivors of the Battle of Little Bighorn gathered one final time at the old battlefield near the Little Bighorn River. Lakota and Cheyenne recounted what they had seen in 1876, when the 7th Cavalry fell. Bill Grota captured the scene, the end of a generation. His life ended in 2020. Photograph from 1904 shows a Navajo dine group crossing Canyon de Chelly in northeastern Arizona territory of the Navajo Nation. The scene documents roots of mobility and herding in the early 20th century, when federal policies and trading posts reshaped practices and movements, linked to expeditions and ethnographic studies. In 1890, in Oklahoma Territory, lawmen posed armed, a symbol of the authority that regulated growing towns and settlements. Their job was to stop crimes, serve warrants, escort prisoners, and secure elections. For settlers and merchants, they embodied justice on a frontier of railroads, makeshift courts, and land disputes. In 1907, Samson Beaver of the Stoney Nakoda Nation encountered Mary Schaffer accompanied by his wife Leah and daughter Frances Louise. From a sketch drawn from memory by Beaver, Schaffer reached Chaba Imne, today Maligne Lake in Western Canada, and put the place on maps, proving how Indigenous knowledge guided the then expanding Euro-Canadian exploration. Photograph from the early 20th century shows passers-by on Main Street in Manhattan, Nye County, in the high desert of Nevada. The town arose in 1867 with the discovery of silver nearby. The 1905 gold rush generated a new settlement boom. More than 4,000 inhabitants quickly established themselves. In 1875, Jesse James posed in a studio, already famous in Missouri for leading an armed gang, robbing banks and trains, and committing murders. With a high bounty on his head, the outlaw's fate was sealed in 1882 in St. Joseph, when Robert Ford, a member of his own group, shot him in the back, ending his life at 34. In 1890 in Oregon, high-pressure water jets were directed against hillsides to loosen layers of earth and release the gold mixed with gravel. The washed material flowed through valleys and clogged streams. To make way for pipes, pumps, and excavations, trees were felled, creating clearings that would mark the impact for decades. Record from 1900, in an unidentified location in the American West. A group of cowboys can be seen gathered around the ranch cart, chuck wagon, at mealtime. Wide-brimmed hats, neckerchiefs, and holsters highlight fieldwork and trail culture. In 1879, Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty and also known as William H. Bonney, was already a central figure in New Mexico Territory. Nicknamed for his youth and daring, he got involved in the Lincoln County War and was accused of killing Sheriff William Brady, making him a top target for federal authorities. In 1869, a man of the Western Shoshone Nation stands on a cliff and faces the tracks that now connect the country. Below, the Humboldt River winds and disappears into the canyon near Carlin. The Union was at Promontory, Utah. The line brings speed and profit, but also marks the taking of tribal lands. The train passes and his story walks along with it. In 1877, a rare record captures outlaw Billy the Kid, then on the rise in New Mexico Territory, sitting at a table with members of his gang. As cards and coins circulated, the scene shows bonds of camaraderie and the idle routine between raids, when his fame was spreading across the Old West amid tensions with authorities. Photograph from 1873 shows inhabitants in front of a church on rocky outcrops in Zuni, Cibola County, desert of New Mexico. The scene is part of 19th century federal surveys and documents the territory where the Zuni people, Eshuwi, have lived for millennia, linking Pueblo layout to the arid landscape. In 1878, a busy street in Dodge City, Kansas, shows the daily life of the expanding frontier. Alongside Deadwood, the town gained notoriety for its concentration of saloons, gambling houses, and brothels, attracting gunmen and outlaws, while sheriffs and marshals with limited resources tried to impose order on the Great Plains. In 1910, in Mercer County, West Virginia, local memory still revolved around two brothers who, half a century earlier, had found themselves on opposite sides of the Civil War. One marched with the Confederates, the other stayed with the Union. The family went on, but the neighborhood retold the story to ask, what makes a home divide like that? Image from 1892 in a Pennsylvania brothel shows a sex worker seated in the service room. The author, a regular client, photographed the scene at an unspecified time. The portrait is part of the set of anonymous records on urban sociability at the end of the 19th century. After a cattle drive in Kansas in 1880, cowboys paused their march and bathed in the lake. On the shore, other cowboys, horses, and a wagon can be seen. Saddles and tack lay on the ground. The routine of these Western workers was exhausting. Long journeys, heat, hunger, and thirst. The bath helped restore strength and prepare for the next stage of the trail. In Skagway, Alaska, 1898, Jefferson Randolph Soapie Smith runs the counter at Jeff Smith's parlor. The Klondike Gold Rush crowds the streets. He operates rigged raffles, shell games, and telegraph scams. He keeps the gang on a short leash and buys official silence, turning the town into his business. Prospectors and speculators became easy prey. Photograph from 1890 shows a large Sioux camp in South Dakota. The tents in a semicircle highlight clan organization and seasonal roots. The Sioux people, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, wove networks of trade and diplomacy. After 1889, the setting indicates mobility in the face of pressure from federal policies. Around 1892, in a Pennsylvania brothel, a sex worker posed in a modest setting, among worn furniture and gas lighting. The scene captures the informal economy of the post-Civil War period, the moral oversight of industrial cities, and the precariousness that pushed women into the sex trade regulated by local authorities. In 3 Block Range, New Mexico, 1908, a family pauses under the shade of a tree with their covered wagon beside them. At the back, the chuck box is open, shelves with pots, tin plates, and provisions. The folding counter becomes a kitchen. The scene shows the travel routine in the West, made of preparation, rest, and long roads. Olive Oatman, young pioneer kidnapped in 1851. At 14, she saw her parents killed by Yavapais in present-day Arizona. She and her sister Mary Ann, age 7, were enslaved and, about a year later, traded to the Mojaves for horses. Among the Mojaves, she received facial tattoos. She was rescued only in 1856 near Fort Yuma. In 1899, William F. Cody Buffalo Bill toured cities with his Wild West show. He had once been a buffalo hunter, scout, and soldier. In the show, fast rides, sharpshooting, and frontier reenactments reached audiences in Europe and the Americas, spreading a version of the conquest of the West. Cody also performed, expanding his fame. Between 1890 and 1900, east of Salem, Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, dense pines share space with fresh clearings. Lined-up stumps show the advance of logging, opening the way for fences, dirt roads, and the first fields. In a few years, the noise of saws gave way to the rhythm of harvests, changing the region's map. Photograph from 1869 shows a Native American in front of the first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869 and linking California to the eastern United States. For urban elites and companies, it symbolized national integration. For many Native nations, territorial loss weakened sovereignty and community and cultural disruption. In 1908, in territorial Arizona, a group of hunters posed in front of a cabin at the end of a journey. They wore canvas and boots, carried repeating rifles, and displayed their kills on the ground. Beside them, hunting dogs waited. The scene shows frontier life, precarious housing, male camaraderie, and subsistence from local wildlife. Around 1905, on a dirt road near Dodge City, Kansas, the routine of a small farm pauses. The Price family poses in front of the clapboard house. On the left, Bill Cope holds a puppy over the bar of a bicycle. Men and women in wide-brimmed hats gaze at the camera, recording a moment of change. Image from 1878 shows the loading of buffalo hides in the hide yard of Dodge City, Kansas. The fur trade, driven by railroads and long-range rifles, led hunters to kill thousands, leaving carcasses on the open plains. The hides went on to tanning and export. In 1890, in the Old West, a gang of young men of African American and indigenous descent operated in poorly policed frontiers. They committed kidnappings, robberies, and violence against women, moving across territories to escape the law. After months of searches, they were tracked across different counties, arrested, tried by local juries, and sentenced to death. In 1910, in Sheridan, Wyoming, a man rides down the street mounted on an elk. It was improvised, but not fantasy. At the turn of the century, northern ranches trained these animals to pull sleds and serve as mounts. The scene sums up a period when frontier work and curiosity went hand in hand in the West, when practical solutions mattered more than rules. In 1887, settler family in Nebraska posing in front of the facade of their house. Work and Sunday clothes contrast. Children in the center, adults on the edges. The frontal framing and daylight indicate a traveling studio and documentary intent of the period. In 1905, Orland Osgood opened a saloon in the region that would later become Carter County, Montana. The place was bar, gambling table, and simple lodging. There, cattlemen, prospectors, and travelers crossed paths on wagon routes to the farms of the state's southeast, trading stories and closing deals in quick stops or long stays. Calamity Jane, Martha Jane Canary, around 1882, a figure of the Dakota Black Hills. She became known for her courage in riding and her marksmanship in confrontations, working as a messenger and guide during the gold rush, serving mining companies and detachments. Her fame spread through Deadwood and nearby areas, placing her firmly in the mythical pantheon of the Old West. In Idaho in the 1890s at Jackson's Bar, the owner rests a rifle on the counter. It's not only for scaring off trouble, it's a warning of who's in charge. Where the sheriff passed by rarely and the law was delayed, commerce turned into a fortress. Each looked after their own, and the peace of the saloon depended on the weapon. Among miners, cowboys, and travelers, the gesture said, "Business, only with respect." In 1892, Creede, Colorado, was still living the Silver Rush. The main street was dirt with wagons moving slowly. On both sides, wooden shops opened early. The post office sign guided newcomers. Telegraph poles marked the way, while the dry slope reminded that the town had grown too fast for the desert. California Gulch near Leadville, Colorado in 1880, district that evolved from alluvial gold of the 1860s to silver carbonate extraction. Shafts, galleries, and small smelters shaped the landscape. The arrival of narrow-gauge railroads integrated the field into trade routes and fueled Leadville's urban boom. In 1878, a shipment of buffalo hides filled the yard of a tannery in Dodge City, Kansas. The pile was the result of commercial hunting that, since the beginning of the decade, had slaughtered entire herds on the Great Plains. Hunters took only the hides, which they sold to middlemen, while the carcasses were abandoned and left to rot in the open. In 1886, in the Loup River Valley, Nebraska, a couple and 3 children put down roots. They built a log cabin and divided their days between wheat farming and cattle by the river. In the forming Midwest, they faced droughts and floods, traded supplies, and bet their future on the next harvest. The railroad was far away and news came slowly. After the Civil War, violence did not end overnight. In Sherman, Texas, in the 1860s, 3 Confederate guerrilla leaders came together: Arch Clement, Dave Poole, and Bill Hendricks, fighters who remained active while the country was being rebuilt. It was the transition from official war to irregular violence on the frontiers. Ex-Sheriff Wild Bill Hickok, the famous Kansas gunfighter, served as marshal in Abilene and earlier as an Army scout in frontier territories. He took part in duels and arrests that marked the westward expansion. In 1876, in Deadwood, he was killed by Jack McCall while playing poker, holding the dead man's hand, an episode that immortalized him. Around 1885, at Fort Whipple near Prescott in the Arizona Territory, a soldier of the 10th Cavalry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers, stands side by side with 3 Apache scouts who served the Army. Together they patrolled routes and tracked signs amid campaigns in the Southwest, where alliances shifted the course of the frontier. A woman of the Aaninan Nation faces forward, calm, with few ornaments that say much. Her full name, Takes a Prisoner Blackbird, comes from stories of resistance. She lived on the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana, in the northern Great Plains, where families maintained language and customs for decades despite federal pressure. Inside a saloon in Utah around 1980, a patron interrupted the establishment's routine to pose next to a horse brought indoors. The unusual scene for the time reflects the persistence of rural display practices in spaces of sociability, blending urban leisure with symbols of work in the American West. On a clear morning around 1885, 2 women in long skirts stop on Cutler Street, the commercial hub of Helena, then the Montana Territory. They speak quickly, perhaps about prices or the mail, while behind them wooden shops open their doors and wagons head toward the mines. Dust rises with each step and the sound of hooves sets the rhythm. Between 1905 and 1912, Irwin E. Smith traveled through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona with glass plates, recording cowboy life at the end of the open range, cattle handling, chuck wagons, night watches, and long rides between ranches. It is a direct portrait of hard work that shaped the West. We see people, dust, and determination in every gesture.